Chief Justice Warren Burger once wrote, "The obligation of our profession is to serve as healers of human conflict." Welcome to Lawyers as Healers, a podcast exploring an evolution happening inside the American legal profession. I am your host, Dave Albrechta. I am a coach, a mediator, and a recovering litigator. In this podcast, I'll explore how and why an increasing number of lawyers are moving beyond adversarial thinking to return to the obligation of our profession, which is to serve as healers of human conflict. Welcome back to Lawyers as Healers. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Myrna McCallum, a lawyer, mediator, and educator who focuses on trauma-informed practice and how the legal system impacts those that it serves. Her work challenges lawyers to rethink how we engage with clients' conflict and with our broader legal systems. Myrna, I'm so excited to have you join us. Before we dive in, I just have to tell you, a few years ago, when I was going through my moment of, we'll call it crisis, for lack of a better word, as a lawyer, your book, Trauma Informed Law, that you edited, this guy, was one of the first books that crossed my desk when I was looking for new ways to be a lawyer. So I'm really excited. You've been on my list as someone I wanted to talk to for a long time. So I'm glad that we're finally getting to connect.
Wonderful. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'd love to just start with, learning a little bit about your journey into law, what led you to be a lawyer, and then maybe a two-part question of then, what happened that made you begin realizing the system was a little off, or what led you to the trauma-informed practice?
hmm Um, well, I want to say, and for anyone who's listened to my podcast, The Trauma Informed Lawyer, I talked about this pretty early on. I've revisited it a few times to say I had a lot of trauma in my own life, in my own background, in my own childhood. And I learned really early on how to dissociate, how to disconnect, how to just really like survive really unsafe spaces. And that gave me the ability to, at least at the time when I was young, believe that I couldn't be hurt, nobody could hurt me, and that was like the driver for a lot of decisions I was making. Survival, right? And when I looked to see what I could do with my life or what kind of work I wanted to do, I saw lawyers on television. That's the only place I saw lawyers. And what I saw was people who were very dehumanizing, very disconnected, very dissociated. I saw myself in them and I
Yeah.
was like, whoa, I think this is where I need to go because these are my people. And then when I went into law school, it just really supported a lot of what I had come to believe about the legal profession, about who lawyers were, facts only, no emotion. We weren't really talking about the people bringing the legal issues. We were just talking about legal issues. And I was like, perfect. I think I'll thrive in this area because I don't really want to focus on people. I don't want to hold space for pain or any of that stuff because I couldn't hold
Yeah.
space for my own pain. And
Mm.
that worked for a while until it didn't. I mean, I became a prosecutor, a defense lawyer, and it was really in my prosecution work that I came to understand that the whole range of human suffering meets you in a criminal courtroom. And a lot of what I was interacting with every day was really a trigger of my own childhood. Like a lot of the assaults, the abuse, the violence, the addictions all echoed what I experienced as a kid, what I'd been running
Yeah.
from for my whole life. And it just brought me it just cornered me and created an environment where I had to face off with it every day. So I had a choice to make. And the choice was I could try to double down and really stay disconnected, but then I would need some help in doing that. And what lawyers tend to turn to is drugs and alcohol to uphold that disconnection from emotion, or other self-harming behaviors, or self-sabotaging behaviors, or I could stop and do something different, which would require me to have to confront the thing I was running from, and then also think about the role that vulnerability and empathy and compassion and all the feeling stuff, what role that would play in my life and in my work. And that's how I came to trauma informed practice as a way of doing what I've been doing for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, you know, one of the, I don't know if this is a cliche of the legal system or whatever, that we're led to believe the best lawyers are able to kind of carry their client's burden and then put it away and go home and like separate themselves from the emotion. Um, and I'm just that I had that belief for a while that the best lawyers were the ones that were able to do that really well, you know. Um, so I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing sharing that.
Definitely, and you know what is really wild, Dave, is that we are in a profession that recognizes and rewards lawyers who are the most disconnected, dissociated, dehumanizing. We see it all the time. Best lawyer, best litigator, best, right? And then when you start to dissect, well, what is it that got them this recognition? It is exactly those practices and those behaviors. The profession rewards that.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, best by what standard? You know.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and so I wonder, maybe you can just start by sharing a little bit more for people that don't know what trauma informed lawyering means or what that is. Just kind of a basic 101 of what that, what it is you teach and what that looks like.
Well, it's really evolved over the years because when I started the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast, that was like in 2020, like around the time the pandemic kicked in. And so we're at 2026 now. And my, thank goodness, like I have like evolved in my thinking. I believe like being a trauma informed lawyer in the early days, what I talked about really was the focus on what mainstream, um, educators promoted, especially mental health, educators, because trauma-informed practice comes from the language of trauma-informed care. I was really opposed to the word care. I didn't wanna connect care and lawyering because I was opposed to it, and I thought if I'm opposed to it, a lot of people will also resist because we don't wanna see ourselves as caregivers or somebody who should be providing care to people. I'm going to come back to that in a couple minutes, but what I would talk about was centering things like psychological safety, um, autonomy, collaboration, trust, transparency, and communication, treating people like they have some power in this space where actually their power or their autonomy is very limited because of how rigid our legal systems and procedures are. But I would invite lawyers to think about like where can we adapt our practice to allow for more personal autonomy. Simple things like how we meet with people, maybe allowing
Yeah.
them to choose where we meet, or also allowing them to choose where they sit in a meeting room, where we sit in a meeting room, how many breaks we take. They can decide that because traditional legal practice tells us we meet in certain rooms, meet in certain boardrooms, meeting rooms, we always sit in the same chair, we tell people to sit here, we close doors, we do things a very structured, rigid way. And I would educate lawyers to say, let's like throw that formula out and think about If we were centering somebody's safety and autonomy and we wanted to collaborate with them and we wanted them to trust us and we wanted them to have a voice, what are some things that we might do differently? So, inviting a lot of questions, asking who supports them as they go through this experience because the experience is going to be a difficult experience. So, also adjusting their expectations about outcomes. Like, this is what you can get in this process, but here's what you're not going to get. What are you hoping for? What are you expecting? We don't have to have all the answers, but I do think that giving clients an understanding of what is possible and what isn't is one of the ways in which we could avoid doing further harm to them. So being really transparent, I still believe is the way to trust. If you want someone to trust you, then you've got to give them all the information and you've got to repeat it.
Yeah.
No matter how many times you feel like you've repeated it enough, unless that person tells you that they're good and that they're clear, then you have to continue repeating the information. And that is where I started off. And what I've come to understand, Dave, since that time is that being trauma informed is like the bare minimum. There's so much more that we need to become. There's so much more that we need to understand, particularly about trauma. So I would say in the early days that we just simply need to understand some basic neuroscience, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. These trauma responses or stress responses that show up, how it drives communication, how it drives memory, how it drives behavior. We just need to understand that. We need to understand that people come to us wounded sometimes, and that really at its core is what trauma is. It's not the event, it's the thing that changed the person as a result of the event. And so making that like distinguishing that for people was really important for me. But what I've come to understand, especially as an Indigenous woman living in Canada, is that there are many forms of trauma. There's intergenerational trauma, cultural trauma, colonial trauma, racial trauma, and there's a lot of racial trauma in the legal profession and in justice systems. And for us to talk about trauma without thinking about the experience of Black and Brown people in these spaces, whether they serve as judges, lawyers, law enforcement, victims, witnesses, accused people, unless we're thinking about how their lived experience has resulted in how they show up in these spaces, then we're not fully informed and we're not fully capable of being responsive. So now I talk a lot about being either trauma responsive, cu- um, culturally responsive, which is for me, it's a step beyond cultural humility because we also need cultural humility, which is very different from cultural competence. And
Mm.
we need to think about what is the ultimate goal here. I often talk about doing no further harm. That's the ultimate goal. But beyond that, I also feel like the ultimate goal needs to be, particularly for Black and Brown people, it's liberation, it's freedom, it's recognizing that systems are built to do what systems do. And if the system is built on harming people, being really adversarial, incapable of holding space for things like dignity, humanity, empathy, compassion, and then maybe what we need to be talking about is how do we build a different system? And so this is where we can begin to look at things like restorative justice practices or look beyond restorative justice practices to other possibilities and what could that look like? And, you know, um, there's still so many questions, and I don't have all the answers, but I think the magic is in the question.
I'm curious what I have so many questions. Speaking of, I have so many questions for you. um, but I wonder what you know what if there's like some main things you could say lawyers are missing when it comes to understanding trauma. You just touched on some of this, but I just kind of want to get clear on like what is it that you think when we come out of law school and we're heading into these jobs, like what are we missing at it kind of bare bones about trauma?
Well, first off, I just want to, give kudos to a number of law schools out there who are now educating future lawyers on trauma. I mean,
Yeah.
UCLA, I've had Alicia Varani and Claudia Pina on my podcast, and they talked about a trauma informed lawyering course that they're teaching at UCLA Law. But I mean,
Wow.
Mitchell Hamline School of Law in Minneapolis, they're also teaching about trauma, and also beyond that, the collaborative work that can occur between lawyers and mental health providers like social workers.
Yeah.
Uh, but those are just two examples. Wisconsin, I mean, a number of American law schools have invited me in because they're starting to do this work. The fact that the ABA published a book on trauma informed law was tremendous. And I really think that that allowed for a green light to a lot of law schools to rethink their curriculum, to explore whether or not there's something here that they're missing, and something here that they could be including that is going to give future lawyers a more well-rounded education and prepare them adequately for what they're going to experience in the field. And what I've been seeing and what I've been hearing and what I would love to see law schools build on is understanding the neuroscience of
Yeah.
giving, like, the neuroscience behind how we give evidence, how traumatized people or wounded people or people who have histories of trauma give evidence. So it's not even so much, Dave, like we could like I'll give you an example. So say somebody is coming into a criminal court process and they're coming there because maybe their home was burglarized, right? Somebody broke into their house. This individual has a history of, let's say, sexual abuse as a child, and they've done everything they could in their life to create safety in their home for themselves because everywhere else in the world they feel incredibly unsafe and vulnerable because of their childhood experience. What happens when their home is burglarized? It rips open this wound of childhood sexual abuse, and now suddenly they don't feel safe at all in their home, and but not just because they've been burglarized, but it pulls open all of those other things and all of those other fears. And then what happens is, your prefrontal cortex goes offline, you're in deep dysregulation, you're
Yeah.
operating from a place of not just dysregulation, but a fierce, like a solid, strong, extreme fear state where you are hyper vigilant again, you are panicky, you are confused, you are agitated, like all of these things are happening. And what would happen oftentimes for lawyers who aren't prepared for that, because maybe the home invasion or the break and enter was just simply somebody opening the door and then an
Yeah.
alarm goes off and then they left. They didn't actually enter the home, they didn't take things. However, even though on its face that appears minor on the range of what a home invasion could be, the individual whose safety was violated can be very, very extreme. Their response could be one that we would think is not proportionate to what has occurred. And it would
Yeah.
leave us scratching our heads. But if we had an understanding a little bit about their history, a little bit about their experience of this, a little bit about neuroscience and how fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses kick in when somebody is feeling unsafe, and how the hippocampus is impacted when somebody has to recall memories about an event that occurred, and also how communication and holding information is impacted, then it would, I think, invite some compassion, some empathy, some patience, some intention to repeat questions, to give people time and space to answer these questions, and also to expect that the reaction we're getting from people, even though it's disproportionate to whatever occurred in our minds or the reasonable person, with an understanding of neuroscience, we could get that okay, actually, what we're seeing here, given this person's situation and background, is a reasonable response. And so, how do we adapt our process to avoid re-triggering them, to avoid doing more harm to them, to prioritize things like psychological safety? It's the same thing when, we talk about survivors of sexual violence who come forward to report either being sexually assaulted or being sexually harassed in the workplace. And there's all these myths that exist about why'd you stay in the job? Or why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you do this? Right. And it's a lot of victim blaming. But if we understood neuroscience or simply, there's some indicators that especially prosecutors have um, for somebody who is trying to like deceive you, or indicators of deception in terms of
Yeah.
how they answer questions, like long pauses or a lot of, well, I think. And if we understood a little bit about how people recall memories and what's going on in the hippocampus of somebody who has experienced trauma, then we would understand as well that it's not so much that somebody is deceiving us, but it is that they are struggling to recall the memories, particularly in the maybe chronological way that we're asking questions. So maybe what we need to do is change up how we ask questions to allow for that person to answer them in a way that allows for them to come across as somebody who is authentically recalling experiences, somebody who is
Yeah.
strong in their recall. Sometimes, like, we set things up to undermine people, to make it really easy for us to call into question their credibility and reliability, when the reality is they are responding like anybody would in those particular circumstances with that particular history. And neuroscientists will tell us this all the time. And so, yeah, if there was like a class on neuroscience and law or neuroscience and evidence, I would love to see that. So this isn't just about like, what does it mean to be a trauma informed lawyer? What does trauma mean? Because the impacts on the brain that I just shared aren't just specific to people who've known trauma, it's also specific to people who are experiencing chronic stress, for example. And that is honestly, that's also a lot of lawyers. It's a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
professionals. It's a lot of people who are in very demanding professions who cannot give their best evidence and cannot show up the way they want to show up because of the chronic state of stress that they are experiencing.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a great segue, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is I had listened to this podcast recently about it was a single episode about the impact of litigation on doctors. It was a medical podcast aimed at physicians, and they were talking about malpractice claims and talking about the impact of going through that process. And as I was listening to them talk about it, I'm like, I mean, nobody talks about, because they were talking about it in terms of trauma, and that it's a traumatic experience. And very few people talk about the trauma that the lawyers are carrying that go through this every single day for decades. Um, and so I just wanted to get your take on that. Like, how does this work in being a trauma informed lawyer? I think when I read that, and most people read that, we think about how we're interacting with clients. But how does this work also impact, or um, yeah, how does it impact lawyers' carrying of trauma, whether it's just from being a lawyer or past traumas or whatever?
Well, I mean, I will tell lawyers all the time and judges as well that being trauma informed or trauma responsive or getting this education in neuroscience isn't simply for the benefit of the public, the parties. It's for your benefit. It will ultimately improve our mental health outcomes going forward as a profession. Because Dave, it's similar both in Canada and the US. We have really horrible mental health outcomes as a profession. We have high rates of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, self-harm, suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression. It goes on and on and on. And it's largely because of crushing workloads, high expectations, um, and then the stress that comes with all the demands that are imposed upon lawyers, plus having to manage and hold space for your client's stress, the managing partner's stress, the all and their expectations about how you should do what you do and how often you should do it and how often you should be available. Like, we're in a profession that doesn't like boundaries. We're in a profession that doesn't like to hear no. We're in a profession that demands go, 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 give, do, fight, 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 that kind of mentality. And when we're in a space like that, it's not sustainable. Absolutely not. And so what ends up happening is you then get lawyers who default to these coping mechanisms because they're just looking for a way to disconnect from what they're experiencing emotionally, because if they were to give their emotional response any kind of time, they might be confronted with the question like, can I survive this system, this practice, this profession? And maybe not. I can't survive it like this, and I might have to leave. And then what does that trigger? That triggers like a whole other bunch of questions about, well, then how do I pay my mortgage? What else will I do? I put so much time and effort into my legal education and money and all these things. And so then who am I if I'm not a lawyer? Right. And a lot of people don't want to ask those questions. And so what I've told lawyers and judges over the years is that if we were to give this a little bit of attention and focus, ultimately what it's going to do is it's going to invite us to not just level up in our education on trauma and our education on neuroscience and our education on the impacts of toxic stress on individuals, but also on an entire profession. It will ask us to learn the tools that are contained within, say, the um, under the umbrella of emotional intelligence. It will ask us to become more
Yeah.
emotionally intelligent. So this isn't about soft skills, because sometimes I get that kind of resistance from lawyers. Oh, there's no place for soft skills like empathy and whatever in law. Okay, even if you believe that, and if you want to believe that, go ahead and believe that. This isn't about soft skills. This is about leveling up your competencies so that you become emotionally intelligent, because your commitment to practicing as an emotionally intelligent lawyer will benefit everyone who's in relationship with you, including yourself, because you will learn the tools of relationship management from an emotional perspective. You will learn the tools of emotional self-regulation, self-reflection, like, why did I react that way? Why was that my immediate go-to? Okay, why do I have this relationship to confrontation? Why is this my default when somebody says this thing? And what would it take for me to lean in to something I'm really feeling uncomfortable around? Like, whether it's somebody crying or somebody screaming or somebody raging or my own rage coming up. Why is my immediate reaction to try to suppress it?
Yeah.
And what else can I do to help myself actually feel what I feel or lean into the discomfort of it all and then process it or metabolize it later so it doesn't stay with me to the point where when I go home, I'm not like yelling at my wife, yelling at my kids, yelling at my husband, kicking the dog, getting on, the porn websites, going to the casino, picking up alcohol, like all of the different things that people do to cope when
Yeah.
they're not feeling, um, or when they're feeling a kind of way that they don't want to feel.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's ultimately going to improve all of these outcomes for us
Yeah.
individually and collectively as a profession.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I kind of wanted to return to some stuff you were talking about earlier about how this impacts the clients. I mean, it seems clear to me that it would make you a better lawyer to be plugged into this kind of stuff, and be informed at the very minimum. Um, you talked about, the impact on clients earlier, and I just get the sense that clients have um, more agency when they're able to be in a safe space and feel like they're um, being understood by the people in the system around them. Could you say just a little bit more about that? And I mean, and I think I'm asking it more from like um, that by tuning into this stuff and being trauma informed and being emotionally intelligent lawyers, our clients would be, I don't want to use the word, like, better client comes up for me, which I don't love that concept. The client is the client, but that they have an experience that allows them to be more authentic in themselves and comfortable. I would think makes them a better witness and makes them better able to make decisions about their case and tell us what direction to go in, all those things that make a client, a good client, for lack of a better word. I just wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
It's so interesting that you say that because we have this like bad client narrative that a lot of lawyers use,
I
right?
know,
Like, or a
I know.
difficult client. Oh, the difficult
Yeah,
client, the difficult client. Um,
yeah, or
and
client manage this all falls under, like, client management, right? Which I'd really
totally.
dislike.
Right, but it is
Yeah.
very different from, like, if we look at emotional intelligence, it's very different from the principle of relationship management. So if we think about our clients as folks that we are in relationship with, not just a transactional relationship, but like a real, a human relationship with, and we ask the question, what do they need to succeed in this space? What do they need to not be further harmed from this experience, even if they don't get the outcome they're seeking? Well, how can I mitigate against that? Well, some of this requires active listening. What I know to be true after years of being a lawyer is that people want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to know what they say to you matters. How do you create an experience like that? If you just came back to those questions, you will be leaps and bounds ahead of where you were like
Mhm,
last year or yesterday. And right? So, like, that is the work for us, and what I wanna say is it's an awesome business case. Like,
mhm,
Daniel Pink wrote this book on, like, how right brainers will rule the world, and it's because, like, and I love this because I'm left-handed, so I'm naturally, like, operating from my right side of my brain, which is the part for empathy and patience and artistry and creativity and all these things, right? And so, if we brought in some of that creativity and we brought in some of that empathy, like, these are things I believe that to this point AI cannot reproduce. So it gives us a leg up because people want an experience. And there's an old saying out there that people don't always remember the thing you said to them, but they remember how you treated them.
that's
What their experience
yeah,
with you was. And so, if you could improve the experience with your client by simply centering that they ensure that they're seen by you, heard by you, and what they said to you matters. Like, if you went back to that formula, not only do you create a relationship with your client that would not bring them back time and time again anytime they have a legal situation. They will refer you, recommend you to everyone, talk about what a different lawyer you are, what an incredible lawyer you are. So it's going
mhm,
to drive more clients to your work. It's going to improve your reputation. But as it does that for the individual lawyer, I believe overall it has the potential to improve the reputation and the credibility of the profession overall. And like, if we're being honest, Dave, on both sides of the border, we could really benefit from improving the reputation of our profession
yeah,
and because right now we lack credibility with a lot of people and for good reason.
yeah, 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 100%. Um I'm curious, if I could get your take on this concept of lawyers as healers, um, because I chose that name because I've felt to me fairly somewhat provocative for people that haven't put those two words in the same sentence before. I base it on this quote by Justice Warren Berger, who said, "The primary or the obligation of our profession is to serve as healers of human conflict." Um, and so I'm just curious, I just want to get your thoughts on that concept of lawyers being healers, whatever your reaction to that might be.
I love it. I love it. And I came across that quote some years ago as well. And I think I did an episode on lawyers as healers and just invited the question for people to actually just sit with that question. Is it possible? Like I took what he said to mean also like to extend, right? Like like healers of community, healers of like relationship, right? And so if we moved away from a more transactional way of delivering legal services and we wanted to center a relational practice, what is the potential for healing and repair for people? Because what I know to be true as somebody who's worked in the criminal justice system is that whatever goes on in the courtroom, I don't believe can actually heal you. And I would often ask people, like, what do you need? And for those who said, I need healing, I need to be who I was before this thing happened to me, I would be really clear to say, this space won't deliver that. But let's look at what can deliver that. Maybe saying what you need to say, saying what you, sharing, like in a victim impact statement, for example, how you were impacted. That's going to be a piece of that healing pie, right? For
Yeah,
example, but there's got to be other things. And I would sit and I would listen to them and talk to them about the whole range of things that might be required to help them heal, but also adjusting their expectations on what legal outcome might occur in that space and its limitations. And I think simply in sitting down with people, recognizing the humanity in them, understanding that people are oftentimes more invested beyond whatever the legal outcome is, like they're seeking something deeper and something that the legal system cannot actually deliver, and just being really upfront about that and exploring what it is that they really need, that can offer people healing. Why? Because it comes back to that formula, Dave. People want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to know what they say to you matters. And when I say that, I also just want to say for the communities who may say, oh, that's so ableist. I'm not talking about physically seeing with your eyes, right? Physically listening with your ears. There are ways in which we can see people, we can hear people, we can communicate that what they said to us matters. That doesn't actually require sight, hearing, etc. There's so many ways we could do that. So the call to action for you is how do you do that? And it doesn't just
yeah,
start with the lawyer. It could start with the very first point of contact and how you train your intake folks, your
right.
receptionist, right? Your paralegals,
Mhm.
your the court clerks. Like there's just so many people who make up this profession, and it needs to also include them.
Yeah. Man, I love that. When I was initially going through this, that was one of the major gaps I saw is that I represented employees, and almost everyone that came into me would say some version of, I don't want to litigate. I'm not that kind of person. This isn't about money. I just want to be acknowledged. I just want them to say that they know they did the thing that harmed me. They want to acknowledge that that what they experienced was real, and that they're not going crazy. And um, I think that's part of what led to my burnout was that as lawyers, you just kind of, because we're trained to issue spot, you just kind of put that away when people say that stuff to you. You're just kind of, "Oh, well, that's okay, whatever. Yep, okay, issues. You have a
Not
great case,
relevant.
sign here."
Not
Yeah,
relevant. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, so that's
And
wonderful.
maybe. Maybe that's part of the work, Dave, is to like ask lawyers to consider what did they put in the not relevant container? Because probably what you're throwing in there is the stuff that you need to lean into and talk about with your client.
And it goes back to what are we, again, like what are we asking people in the intake, whatever your intake system looks like. And shifting that was one of the first things I did was, hey, what do you value in your life? What do you care about? What, all these other questions, what do you really want out of this? And spending time on those questions became important, which I think not enough of us do. Um, so, some final questions for you. I could talk to you for a long time, but we got to wrap it up. I'm curious, what are some, what's the kind of low hanging fruit for lawyers? What are some easy things they can do to start adopting some of these practices and being more trauma informed with clients?
Um, Before I answer that question, I wanted to say something before it completely leaves my brain, but it's really in response to something you said about experiencing burnout. What I would invite folks who are in this profession to consider to really sit with for a few minutes is what are the features of burnout that you identify with?
Mm,
Because what I have found listening to so many people is they will use the label burnout. Oh, I'm just burned out. I'm burned out. I'm burned out. And then when you start to unpack some of their experiences, what you find is people are mislabeling their experience. So what they're calling burnout is sometimes vicarious trauma. Sometimes what they're calling vicarious trauma is direct traumatization. Sometimes what they're calling burnout is actually being in a state of chronic toxic stress. And if we could start to look at vicarious trauma, chronic toxic stress, or secondary traumatic stress disorder, direct traumatization, burnout, and begin to explore actually what makes these things different, what makes them similar, and then where do I actually accurately fit? That will help people who are trying to recover from psychological harm in a way that maybe will set them up for success or overcoming it a lot more quicker if they've rightly diagnosed themselves, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I wanted to say that. And
yes, thank you
also
for saying that.
and I think for sure, and I think when we're also looking at that, we also need to examine the impact um, of our own intergenerational trauma or our own racial trauma or our own childhood trauma. Um, what the impact of that has on exacerbating these more current situations that we're in. Because what I've come to learn is that traumas tend to be very cumulative. They pile up, they pile up, they pile up. And so you maybe have a direct experience that is the result of a particular litigation, but it's compounded by something else from another time in your life in a completely unrelated space, but it's still there and then it goes up, right? This is why things like complex PTSD is really getting traction as something that is driving a lot of information, education, conversation right now, complex post traumatic stress disorder. And how many lawyers are actually experiencing that too? So we have to think
Yes.
about these things.
Yes.
Anyway,
Well, no, I really appreciate you saying that because I've actually, it's funny. I've been saying that to people too, that I've like burnout is just overused. It oversimplifies our experience. And it's a term we kind of just automatically jump to as this kind of catch-all for any experience where we're just kind of, having a tough time with work. So I
totally.
really appreciate you pointing that out.
It's
Yeah.
it's an umbrella term, and I also wanna say to people who are listening to this who might be identifying with those words, there's so much more there, like moral injury is another thing that more of us need to be unpacking and exploring, and also I get that sometimes people will default to things like burnout, because if they say burnout, it allows for more of a arm's length. Like we as human beings like to default oftentimes to denial. So we deny our own experience, right? That didn't happen to me. No, I haven't actually been traumatized. I'm just burnt out. I'm just working too hard. I've just been like a high achiever, high performer, and it's taking its toll. We could tell ourselves that because it keeps us from actually looking at the deeper thing that maybe actually somewhere along the way we've experienced trauma in this work or maybe before it, and it's been compounded by the work we do. So compassion, self-compassion is key.
Yeah, and we could have a whole conversation just about that burnout topic. I mean, I read an article just the other day about it was a study on perfectionism and lawyers and how it affects the industry, and it was talking about maladaptive perfectionism, which I hadn't heard of before, and I was like, oh my god, that I could relate to a lot of that. Which is just like another version of what you have going on related to our industry and how it functions. So.
Absolutely. And I mean, like the perfectionism, micromanaging, being type A, which a lot of us identify with, is also a feature of the flight response, which is a stress or trauma response, right? Flight isn't just about running away, getting in your car, driving away. Flight is also about go, 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 give, 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 having everything be totally perfect, making sure that everything is in order, having everything lined up just so like working all the time, giving, trying to control everything. That is also a flight response. So, I mean, I could talk about it forever. But back to your point about what are some basic things that lawyers could do, low hanging fruit, if they want to bring a trauma informed practice or trauma informed elements into their practice? Making a little bit more time, like adding maybe 15 minutes, like a 15-minute buffer to all of your client interviews so that you're not rushing people through and you give them a little extra time if they need it to say what they have to say. Simply ask yourself some questions like, how can I ensure that this person feels seen, heard, and what they said to me matters? What can I do to allow for that to happen, to create that experience? Maybe even simply asking yourself the question, what kind of experience do I create for other people when I'm in conversation with them? And what kind of experience do I want to create for people? Learn about things like psychological safety and figure out, how do I center safety in this conversation? Because the reality is when a lot of people show up to see lawyers, they're not there because, they want to check in on their lawyer and bring us lattes. No, they're there because it's a relationship of necessity. They have to be there. And if we were to look at that dynamic alone, we should understand that anytime we're in a relationship because we have to be in that relationship, it immediately triggers powerlessness, helplessness, fear, stress, all the things. And so, what can we do to alleviate that? It goes beyond simply offering someone tea and water. You can ask somebody, like, where would you like to meet? What works for you? Do you want to bring a support person to this conversation with you? Who do you have supporting you? This could be a long litigation. You're going to need emotional support beyond what I'm able to give. This is how, going back to what I said about trauma informed care, this is actually how we demonstrate care for people. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should be care providers or caregivers, but I do think that we could communicate care for people. And this is how we do it. So recognizing there's limitations on who we are as service providers and what we can offer, but simply recognizing that somebody is going to need supports beyond what we do and what we offer is not, is not demanding anything from you. It's just allowing you to and communicating that you recognize that maybe some people need more holistic support. And so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can start there.
Yeah. I love that. That's great. Um, and final question, just to end on an optimistic note, I'm just curious what gives you hope about where the legal profession and industry and systems are headed. You mentioned the law school, these new classes, which I didn't know about, is super exciting. But what else? Is there anything else out there that gives you some hope?
What gives me hope is that I have been really fortunate to create like a global community of lawyers that I call in every spring here to Vancouver for a conference that I put on called Justice is Trauma. They come from all over the world, whether they work in the International Criminal Court or they do family law somewhere in Nigeria or they, are working within a restorative practice somewhere in New Zealand. They all come with all of their experiences and all of their projects, all of their initiatives, the things that are succeeding, the things that are in demand, and some of the challenges that they're facing. And they collaborate, they create community, and they engage in conversations that not only sustain them in their work, but offer them some validation and some encouragement. And then I add in some healing practices, which builds up their heart, their spirit, their mind, so that they know that when they go back into the world to do the work that they do, they have these practices that they can lean on to help sustain them, support them, and maybe even share with other people within their networks um, to do together. Because any kind of healing, any kind of growth can't happen in isolation. It has to happen in community and in relationship. And so this is something they take away, and that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, Dave. And also seeing lawyers like yourself creating podcasts called Lawyers as Healers. What? Like 10 years ago, nobody would even put those two words together. But now people are starting to ask those questions. And I love it.
Yeah, amazing. And last but not least, you've mentioned your podcast, Trauma Informed Lawyer, which, by the way, is my favorite cover art of any podcast I've seen. I love your cover art, and the podcast is really good too. Um, and so, where can people find you, and wherever you might be online or whatnot?
Yep. People can come to my website, myrnamccallum.co. They could just Google the Trauma Informed Lawyer. They will find me. They'll find my podcast. It's on Apple, Spotify, all the places where you get podcasts. And also read the Trauma Informed Law book that you referenced at the start of this conversation. It was published by the American Bar Association. It centers conversations around healing and resilience and trauma. And it highlights a lot of voices of a lot of people who are already who've woken up to this conversation, recognize the gaps, and are committed to doing things differently, where we center humanity and dignity. And it's a movement, and I really hope your listeners will join us in this work.
Well, thank you again for all you've done over the years and being a big part of building this movement and the workshop you do. It's just all amazing work. So I encourage everyone to go check out your website, and I just thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, yeah, of course.